Five Nights at Freddy's. Fazbear Frights. Number 8. Gumdrop Angel. Stitchwraith story. The first thing Larson was aware of when he fought through the cloudy filaments of unconsciousness was the beeping. The next thing he noticed was the smell. An off-putting combination of chicken soup, urine, and bleach. Finally, the rest of his senses kicked in. His eyes squeezed shut against an assault of bright light, and his body squirmed in reaction to pain in its gut, his ribs, his head, his side, and the back of his hand. He also wasn't happy with the dry, cottony feel of his mouth. He worked his tongue around his teeth as he hesitantly opened his eyes. "There you are!" a chirpy female voice said. Larson grimaced, but turned toward the sound. A rosy-faced, petite woman in a pink nurse's uniform hovered over him. The nurse was cute, dark-haired and green-eyed. Her name tag read, Anita Starling. Larson felt her warm fingers against his skin as she touched the back of his hand, near the area that hurt. He groaned as he tried to shift so he could see what was wrong with his hand. "Aha!" Anita said. "Your stomach muscles aren't ready for that kind of thing yet." The source of the hand pain was an IV needle poking beneath his skin. Larson frowned at it. He tried to form a question, but his mouth was too dry. Anita moved away and picked up a small paper cup holding a bendable straw. "Here!" She lifted the cup near his chin and tucked the straw between his lips. He sucked in water, blessedly wet and cool. "Not too much," she warned. "You had a nasty infection, and you underwent a rather long surgery. Your body isn't ready to guzzle water." "Infection," Larson managed. His voice sounded like it had been shredded by a cheese grater. He cleared his throat as he tried to piece together the last thing he could remember. "I'll get the doctor in here to explain it to you," Anita said. "All I know is that it was a bizarre infection, and it was apparently killed by whatever burned your stomach." "Burned?" Larson asked. He idly wondered how long he'd be speaking in a single-word questions. Anita adjusted the scratchy blanket that was tucked under Larson's chin. "Like I said, I'll get the doctor in here. He can probably tell you more." As it turned out, the doctor wasn't much help. When he visited Larson later that day, he told Larson the infection couldn't be identified. The detective had a hand-sized third-degree burn on his belly. The doctor asked Larson if he knew what had caused it. Larson feigned ignorance. By the time the doctor had come in, Larson had recovered a hazy memory of the Stitchwraith kneeling next to him, putting a red-hot hand against Larson's stomach. But he wasn't able to try to describe that to the doctor. Once Larson was home and recovering in his apartment, he began champing at the bit to get back to work. The chief had other ideas, though. Larson was on leave until he received medical clearance. At least the convalescence gave Larson more time to spend with Ryan. His ex-wife was letting the boy visit every day, and the video and board games Larson and Ryan played helped pass the time. Even so, Larson had endless hours at night to think about the events at the factory, and he'd come to a tentative conclusion. The conclusion was strange and surprising. So surprising that Larson was having trouble accepting it. Even so, he was pretty sure his reasoning was sound. He strongly suspected that the Stitchwraith wasn't evil after all. After Larson was free of whatever they'd given him for pain at the hospital, his memory of the inexplicable events at the factory became perfectly clear. He could see every detail in his mind's eye, and two of them were standing out. One, the Stitchwraith had appeared to resist being drawn into Afton's amalgamation, and two, the Stitchwraith had burned the infection out of Larson's belly. These two details, unless Larson was misinterpreting them, seemed to suggest pretty clearly that the Stitchwraith wasn't as bad as Larson had thought it was. If the Stitchwraith was Afton, as Larson had thought, why would it have held itself apart from the trash monster? And if it was Afton, why had it removed the infection? Larson intended to find the Stitchwraith. He needed to determine exactly what the thing was, whether it was evil or not. That, however, would have to wait. Larson had a more pressing problem to deal with first. It was 2:25 a.m., and Larson was lying in his bed, staring at the spidery patterns of light the street lamps threw across the ceiling fan. For at least the 10th time since he came home from the hospital, he was trying to figure out what was happening to him. Because something was wrong. Very wrong. Larson's physical wounds were healing well. Each day the pain from his injuries lessened a bit. But he was experiencing a mental symptom that quite frankly terrified him. So much that Larson had asked his doctor for a CAT scan to be sure he hadn't suffered a brain injury. When the doctor asked why this was needed, Larson was vague. "Weird vision issues," he'd said. The CAT scan didn't uncover anything wrong with Larson's brain. That was both good and potentially bad. The web-like chiaroscuro that held Larson's attention was blurry, and Larson was trying to bring it into focus. As always, when he had one of the episodes he was having right then, he felt dizzy, and everything around him devolved into a nearly transparent haze. Through that haze, Larson was seeing things he shouldn't have been able to see. He was getting glimpses into the past. These glimpses weren't like daydreams, like the mental pictures that he could summon up when he let his mind wander. These glimpses were real, or at least they seemed real. They were memories, but not his own. These images belonged to others, from different places and different times. Right now, for instance, beyond the shadows on his ceiling, Larson was watching Freddy Fazbear and the other animatronics that had been all the rage when Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was in its heyday, as they performed a rousing rendition of an 80s rock song Larson hadn't heard in years. The music was so loud and its bass so intense that Larson could feel the beat vibrating his mattress. That was the strange thing about these visions he was having. He wasn't just seeing things from the past. He was experiencing them. In addition to the vibrations that fluttered through his body, Larson could smell fresh pizza, since all he'd eaten earlier was a frozen turkey dinner and some popcorn he'd shared with Ryan. He had no explanation for the aromas of tomato sauce and cheese that seemed to waft around him. As Larson watched the animatronics perform on a stage that looked like it was filling his bedroom, the scene shifted. This was another thing that was freaky. Not only was he dropping into these lifelike vignettes, but they also changed constantly. 1 minute he was in Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The next, he was at the movie theater. The next minute, he was hanging out with his friends. Or at least someone else's friends. But always, no matter how many times he jumped from one scene to the next, the filler, that's how he'd come to think of it, between the scenes was always the same. As his mind swept from one visit to the past to another, he always saw the same thing in between. He saw a ball pit. The weird thing about the ball pit was that Larson couldn't remember ever having seen it in real life. Sure, he'd seen a ball pit before. Ryan had liked playing with them when he was really little, but Ryan hadn't played in this ball pit. The ball pit that Larson kept seeing was a disgusting ball pit. It was old, and the ball's red, blue, and green plastic surfaces were faded. They were also woolly with dust and mildew, as if they hadn't been touched in decades. They smelled, too, not only of that dust and mildew, but of something else, something coppery and decaying. Also, it wasn't entirely accurate to say that Larson just saw the ball pit. He actually experienced it, as if he were in it. When the ball pit appeared to him, he could feel the gory plastic around him, like he was swimming through beads of sphere-shaped water, except it didn't feel clean like water. In addition to the dusty, mildewy film that made the balls feel scummy, the plastic seemed to have something vicious on it. The spheres tried to adhere to him like Velcro. Larson blinked when his dizziness abruptly went away and his bedroom came back into focus. This always happened. The visions left him as quickly as they appeared each time. Lawson sat up and rubbed his eyes. He rose and shuffled into the kitchen for a drink of water. Standing in front of his sink, he gazed out the small window above it. The night was stormy. All he could see was blackness and rain sporting the panes. He shivered as he ran water into a glass. Gulping the water, he turned away from the shadow. "Enough!" he said out loud. It was time for Lawson to get back to work. And the first thing he needed to do was find the ball pit. He was seeing it for a reason. It had to be related to all the other weirdness he'd experienced. He was going to figure out how it fit into the rest of the puzzle. Pulling his cloak tighter around his doll face, Jake picked his way down a narrow alley. Rain was falling steadily, and even though Jake's doll face eyes weren't real, it still felt weird to have water in them. Jake was happy he'd found the cloak he was wearing. It wasn't waterproof. He thought it was made of wool, but it was heavy, and it kept most of the water off his face and metal body. It also hid what he was, a little. He still had to keep to the dark back streets, the corners and crevices of the world. Jake had been hiding for 9 full sunrises and sunsets since he'd left the factory. During that time, he'd felt sadder than he could ever remember being. He missed having Andrew with him in the strange thing he was in. And he felt overwhelmed by the knowledge he carried, that something bad was out there. He thought about trying to find the bad thing, but what could he do about it if he found it? Besides, he was scared. As Jake passed an open dumpster pressed up against the outer wall of a tall brick building, he heard a scuttling sound. He watched a rat scurry down the side of the dumpster's scarred green metal. When the rat scampered toward the edge of the brick wall, Jake spotted an old, worn hiking boot that moved when the rat ran past it. Jake stopped and peered behind the dumpster. The boot was attached to a man who had long hair and a tangled beard. Jake couldn't tell the man's age. He also couldn't tell whether the man was alive. The man's foot had twitched, but his face was pale, and his eyes were closed. Suddenly, the squawk of a siren and the flash of bright headlights invaded the alley. Jake didn't hesitate. He dropped into a squat next to the man. Water sluiced over Jake. It was overflowing the building's gutters, dropping to the ground in almost solid wet sheets. The siren screeched again, and a shout rang out. Jake shrank back against the wall. As Jake moved, he lost his balance, and he put out a hand to steady himself. His hand landed on the man's shoulder. When it did, the man groaned and moved, exhaling a rank, garlicky breath. "Oh no!" Jake thought. He immediately felt a wave of suffocating regret. He'd killed another person! But wait! The man didn't stop breathing. Jake could hear the man snorting exhales. No black blood ran down his face. He was alive! The siren sound stopped, but Jake could still see the glow of the headlights. Above the patter of the rain, he could hear raised voices. Despite what he could see and hear, though, Jake's consciousness was no longer in the alley. He found himself in a cozy, bright dining room. The dining room was dominated by an old oak table around which sat a happy family. At first, the mom and dad and 2 children laughing and eating didn't seem at all familiar to Jake. However, as he watched them share pot roast and stories about their days, he realized he was seeing a slightly younger, happier version of the man lying behind the dumpster. Jake didn't know why he was getting a glimpse into the man's past, but he liked it. The scene was so heartwarming. All the sadness that had weighed on him over the past few days began to disappear, until the scene abruptly changed. Suddenly, the dining room was gone, and Jake was yanked harshly to what he figured were the man's memories. At eye-boggling super speeds, Jake watched the man go to work, come home, play with his kids, have dates with his wife, and go on trips with his whole family. It was like riding a fast train through an amusement park. But then the happy train crashed. It was a real crash. Real for the man anyway. Jake's good feelings collapsed into grief as he watched the man crawl from the wreckage of his family van. He wailed in despair as emergency workers pulled his dead family one by one from the crumpled metal. Devastated by what he was seeing, Jake started to remove his metal hand from the man. Jake didn't want to feel what this man felt then, the sharp loss the man still felt now. But Jake also couldn't stand to leave the man caught in this web of misery. What if Jake could do something to help? Jake concentrated, and he sent his thoughts back through the soup of memories he'd just seen. Maybe he could pull one out, a good one, and make it bigger and brighter than the rest. If he could ease the man's pain. He had to try. Jake knew exactly which memory to make the biggest. It was the first one, the happy family dinner. Jake put all his focus on that memory. He pushed his intention into it so it puffed up in his mind. It was almost like blowing up a balloon. Only the balloon was a memory and the air was Jake's will. Jake made the memory bigger and bigger, and then he gently suggested it back to the man's unconscious mind. In a way, he put the man's mind inside the bubble of that one happy scene. And then Jake let go of the man. As soon as he did, he was back in the alley. The rain was coming down harder now, and the voices Jake had heard before were coming closer. Jake had to get out of there. First, though, he looked down at the man to make sure he was okay. And Jake was happy to see that the man's face was no longer contorted with pain. In fact, the man looked like he might have been smiling, and his breathing was softer, more even. A clatter and the sound of footsteps spurred Jake to action. He leaned forward and looked around the corner of the dumpster. 2 men were making their way down the alley toward where Jake hid. They'd find him if he didn't do something. Jake looked around. There was no way he'd be able to run off without being seen. But behind him, a small door led into the brick building whose gutter was spilling water over the dumpster. Jake quickly grasped the doorknob and wrenched it. The door gave way, and he slipped into the darkness inside. Closing the door behind him, Jake stood next to it for several seconds, listening. The rain could still be heard in there, but otherwise, the place was silent. Pressing his hands against the door to keep it closed, he waited to see if the men would try to open it. After several minutes, he relaxed. They must have moved on. Jake turned and surveyed his surroundings. A weak glow from a sputtering streetlight came through a dirty window a few feet from the door. It was enough to reveal stacks of boxes and crates. He was in some kind of storage room. Jake moved farther into the room and lowered his endoskeleton onto a crate. He threw back the hood of his cloak and thought about what had just happened. What he'd been able to do was pretty cool. But how did he do it? He didn't know, but just thinking about how he'd been able to help that man, even if just for that night, made him a little less sad. Maybe he could do more than just lurk in the dark. Maybe he could do something good. As soon as Jake had this thought, he heard a muffled scrape. Standing, he looked around again. He still saw only boxes and crates, but when he heard a faint snore, he started looking behind the stacks. Just past the third stack he explored, Jake found a tall, skinny teenage girl. Wearing just a thin gray t-shirt and ripped jeans, the girl was curled on her side, asleep. She looked cold, so Jake took off his cloak and bent down to cover her. When he crouched next to her, he realized that she was more passed out than asleep. Her face was slack, and the circles under her eyes were so dark they looked like smudges of charcoal. Jake tucked his cloak around the girl, and as he did, a scene from an old TV commercial flashed through his mind. It was one of the anti-drug commercials that stamped the slogan, "Just Say No," across scenes of pale, passed-out skinny teens. This girl looked like one of the ones in the commercial. Jake frowned as he gazed at the girl. He knew how destructive drugs could be. Drugs killed people. This poor girl was in trouble. She obviously needed help. Maybe Jake could do something for her. Studying the girl and the muted light, he saw that if she hadn't been so pale and thin, she might have been pretty. She had long, reddish-brown hair that was thick and wavy. It was dirty and tangled now, but he thought it could look nice if it were washed and brushed. He couldn't see the girl's eyes, but her features were nice. As he looked at her face, though, he noticed that her lips were dry and cracked. She needed water. Looking around once again, Jake managed to find a discarded plastic container. He took the container to the door, opened the door a couple inches to check outside, and, when he didn't see anyone, he stepped out and held the container under the heavy rain. It only took a few seconds to fill the container, and once that was done, Jake ducked back inside the room. He hurried over to see if he could get the girl to swallow the water. The girl moaned when Jake nudged her lips with the container. He frowned, not sure what to do next. Before he could figure it out, the door behind him swung open, the wind blowing rain into the room. It blew in something else too. 2 men swept through the open door. One of them slammed it closed. Although Jake wasn't at all hidden from the men, the room was so dim that he was pretty sure they didn't see what he was at first. Or if they did, they didn't seem to care. "What are you doing in here?" one of the men growled. This man was the smaller of the two, but that wasn't saying much. Both men were tall and broad-shouldered. Jake could tell that neither man was a nice man. One of them was scowling, and the other had features that were settled into what was probably a permanent sneer. They both had dark, mean eyes. "Are you deaf?" the second man asked. "He asked you a question." The second man, whose face was covered with old scars, stomped over and kicked at Jake. Jake didn't react, but the movement and the sound woke up the girl. She opened her eyes. They were a deep blue, and immediately she hugged herself, curling up tighter, as if she could wrap her body in a cocoon of safety. She was clearly afraid of the scar-faced man. When the girl's gaze flitted to the second man, and she tried to scoot backward, Jake could see that she knew both of them. Jake shifted his attention back to the men. Jake was pretty sure they were dealers. The 2 men started approaching. Jake decided he needed to make them go away. He stood up. Now that Jake was upright, the men couldn't fail to see Jake's metal endoskeleton. It didn't seem to faze them, though. Both men gave Jake a nonchalant once-over. "What are you supposed to be?" the scar-faced man asked. The other man laughed. "Get lost on your way to our costume party?" When Jake didn't respond, Scarface charged toward him. "Get out of the way, punk!" He pointed at the girl. "She owes me money!" Jake didn't move. He wasn't going to let these men bully the poor girl. He crossed his arms because he thought it would make him look tougher. The men sidestepped Jake as if he were nothing. As Jake turned, Scarface strode to the girl and kicked her leg. "Where's my money, you piece of trash?" "Hey!" Jake shouted. "Leave her alone!" Both men laughed, and Scarface pulled out a knife. Before he could do anything with it, though, Jake took a quick step forward. He didn't think, he just acted. His anger and outrage were driving him. Jake grabbed the scowling man and lifted him easily. Dangling the man in front of him, Jake shook him hard. The man immediately went from sarcastic jerk to sniveling kid. He started crying. "Please, please!" the big man begged. "I didn't mean..." Jake didn't bother to listen to whatever the man was going to say. He was too angry to hear clearly anyway. It felt like an ocean was rolling in his head. He could feel heat pulsing through his endoskeleton. Jake gave the man another violent shake. Then he tossed him through the window. Glass shattered and sprayed. Rain splattered in through the hole the man's body had made. Jake turned toward the other man. The man with the scar held up his hands and cowered away from Jake. "Hey, it's just business!" He was whining like a kid, too. Jake didn't care. He stepped forward and backhanded the man across the jaw. The man went flying into a stack of boxes. He rolled onto the ground, and Jake dropped down on top of him. Jake's rage burned even hotter, and when he pointed a finger at the man's face, his finger was glowing red hot. Jake studied the man's cruel eyes. Easily holding the struggling man down, Jake thought for a few seconds. He bent over and held the tip of his middle finger against the man's forehead. A few minutes later, Jake stepped out of the alleyway and looked up and down the main street. The girl, cradled in his arms, had passed out again, She felt nearly weightless to Jake. Jake shifted his cloak so it covered her face. Then he strode down the street, searching for a safe place where he could take care of her. After 2 days of rain, the sun had come out, and everything, still damp from the storm, seemed to glitter in the brightness. Or maybe that was just Lawson's mood. He was feeling good. Well, maybe not good, but better. He spent most of the morning tracking down buildings that might contain the ball pit that kept sucking him away from the real world. The threads he pulled at were serpentine, and they resulted in a list of a dozen possible locations. Over the next couple hours, Lawson visited more decrepit, boarded-up arcades than he'd cared to see. But eventually, his search led him to the derelict place he stood in front of now. A tired-looking man gave Lawson the key to what appeared to be an old restaurant. Then the old guy shuffled off, as if he didn't care at all what Lawson might do to the place. Lawson could see why. The cavernous dining room he stood in held nothing but cracked vinyl booths and scarred tables. The tables were lined up on a black and white checkerboard floor, and the booths hugged pale yellow walls that had vague shapes attempting to peek through the wall's bad paint job. In addition to the tables and booths, the room held an empty stage and a bare dance floor that looked forlorn under a smudged, broken mirror bowl. The room was thick with dust. Whole civilizations of dust bunnies wafted when Lawson moved. The air in the place smelled musty. It was also vaguely sour, like the inside of a refrigerator filled with spoiled food. Lawson put the back of his hand to his nose. As soon as Lawson had entered the place, he'd spotted what he was looking for. The ball pit was in the back right corner of the room. Cordoned off by a dingy yellow rope, the ball pit warned away potential visitors with a sign that read, "Do not use." "Who would try?" Lawson muttered, as he walked toward the place that had commandeered his consciousness so many times in the past few days. It wasn't a figment of his imagination. It actually existed, and it clearly wanted him to find it, which was disturbing in the extreme. Lawson glanced over his shoulder and gave himself a mental shake. He was a cop, for Pete's sake. He wasn't scared of a stupid ball pit. Was he? Lawson crossed over to the limp, dirty yellow rope. He lifted it, ducked beneath it, and stepped up to the edge of the ball pit. He studied the plastic balls. They looked exactly the same as they did in his visions. They were dusty, mildewy, and faded. He reached out and picked one up. It was just as he knew it would be, rough and somehow sticky, like it wanted to cling to his skin. He frowned and scraped a fingernail over the sphere's surface. Something flaky, almost charred-looking, coated the plastic. Lawson wanted to drop the filthy ball. But Lawson wasn't there to be grossed out. He was there to investigate. So, he didn't drop the ball. Instead, he held it up in front of his gaze and examined it closely. He frowned. The substance covering the plastic surface looked like blood. Old blood. Lawson took out his penknife and dug an evidence bag from his pocket. He took scrapings off the ball. Then he examined a few more plastic balls. All had the same substance on their surfaces. Lawson took multiple samples. When he was done, he stepped back and stared at the creepy pit. Finally, he shook off the heebie-jeebies that gripped him and left the abandoned restaurant. The young doctor was wiped out, which was normal. She was on the tail end of a triple shift, and the stream of patients coming through the ER never ended. Brushing hair from her face, the doctor pushed through the door to exam room 4/5. The room had 2 beds separated by a curtain. She shoved the curtain back and looked at the 2 patients in the side-by-side beds. Both patients were men. Both looked like drug dealers. She'd seen that kind too many times to count. The bigger man had come into the ER screaming, but after the doctor had determined he had a broken collarbone, she'd ordered a morphine drip. That man was now drifting in La La Land. The second man wasn't as badly injured, but his forehead appeared to be burned. The doctor pulled a treatment tray up to the man's side. She reached for some gauze. "Let's get this cleaned up and see what needs to be done," she said. He didn't respond. He just moaned. The doctor blotted at the man's forehead for a few seconds. Then she stopped. She sucked in her breath. Now that she cleared up the area, she could see that someone had burned the words, "Just say no," into the man's forehead. Near the railroad tracks along the edge of town, a small maintenance shed squatted well away from anything else in the area. It was padlocked when Jake found it, but he'd easily removed the lock. Now Jake and the girl were safely tucked inside the small building. The girl was still asleep. Jake was watching her carefully. Jake found the shed right before dawn. After he put the girl inside, he went back out and quickly foraged for something to make her more comfortable. He found some blankets in a nearby dumpster, and he came back to layer the driest of them over her frail form. Soon after night gobbled up dusk, the rain, which had left the area that morning, returned. A steady drumming now pounded on the tin roof above Jake's head. It sounded like a troop of gnomes tap dancing to music Jake couldn't hear. The clamor didn't seem to bother the girl. She occasionally murmured in her sleep, and sometimes she kicked out as if fending off an unseen assailant. But mostly she was quiet and still. Jake sat next to her, watching over her. He also watched the door. Although he'd secured it with some rope he'd found in the shed, he was on alert. He didn't know who else might be after the girl, or when they might come looking for her. For the first couple hours after nightfall, all was quiet, except for the gnome dancing. However, when the rain let up for Jake to hear an owl hoot nearby, he heard something else. Something that had him standing, poised to fight. Outside the shed, something scraped across the wood siding. After the scrape, a metallic rattle cascaded down the door, then seemed to scrabble up the wall next to it. Then something thumped on the roof and clicked down the other side of the shed. Jake traced their movement carefully. Something was out there. Something was crawling out there. He was sure of it. Jake pulled his metal legs close to his body and edged nearer to the girl. He knew he was currently occupying a big endoskeleton, but right this second, he didn't feel like that. He felt like the kid he really was. Something was outside the shed, scrabbling around it, as if trying to find a way in. Jake cocked his head, listening. He put an arm protectively over the girl, just in case whatever was out there broke through the roof. But he also trembled. He wished someone was there to put an arm over him, too. And that is the end of the Stitchwraith story. Thank you for listening to this read-through of Five Nights at Freddy's Fazbear Frights number 8. Gumdrop Angel, Stitchwraith story. I really hope you enjoyed listening to it. If you did, please hit that like button. And if you are new to this channel, why not subscribe to get the next Stitchwraith story and the next Fazbear Frights novel. Also, make sure you click that bell icon so you'll be notified the next time I post a story. And I'll be back next time with the next Stitchwraith story.